Welcome to the Good Growing Podcast. I am Chris Enroth, horticulture educator with University of Illinois Extension, coming at you from Macomb, Illinois, and we have got a great show for you today. The old-timey remedies. With these things that used to probably be more commonplace in the garden, and every once in a while you do still hear some of these being told or touted for use in our modern gardens. We're going to talk about these old-timey things that people used to do. Do they still do them? Recommended? Yes, no, yes. Well, you know I'm not doing this by myself. I'm joined, as always, every single week by horticulture educator Ken Johnson in Jacksonville. Hey, Ken.
Hello, Chris. Yeah, I hope some of these people aren't doing anymore because there's some pretty interesting techniques that we've come across.
Yes, some doozies, I'd say. That would probably get the cops called on you if you tried some of these days. But
You'd be violating the Geneva Convention for some of them too.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, you definitely would. So, oh my goodness, we have got a quite the list, and really, this is just a select few. And so I guess we could put the call out to our listeners and viewers. If you know of other wild, wacky things that used to be done in the garden, maybe it's things that like your parents, grandparents, great grandparents, you might hear some wild stuff that happened in the garden. Yeah, throw those down below, and yeah, happy to see take a look at some of these other wild things. I mean, there's a lot. There's a lot. Why do you think people sprayed so much crazy stuff in their gardens way back when? Because everyone says, "Oh, let's go back to how it was, the old-timey ways," but we have been trying to figure or create pesticides since, well, after reading some of this stuff, forever, since agriculture started.
Yeah, I think I ran across some stuff, 2000 BCE, the oils and things like that. So yeah, it's thousands and thousands of years we've been trying to kill pests. And in the past, it's been some pretty toxic stuff. Relatively speaking, most of the stuff we're using today is much less toxic, orders of magnitude less toxic than some of the stuff that's been used in the past.
That's right. Yeah. So I think it's going to be fun. So Ken and we're going to be referencing a lot of different documents here. So I guess bear with us if we need to pause and like read for a second to make sure we're getting all this as accurate as we can. But I don't know, should we dive into this list, Ken? This first one here. Okay, let's do it. Now this first one is still used today. I will admit to buying this thing actually. It's vinegar. Straight up vinegar, an acid, something to burn plants. And I guess I could say in terms of modern day use, vinegar is one that you can't just use your vinegar out of the pantry. You have to go get an herbicidal vinegar, something that has been formulated for using outside on plants, and it's really just a higher concentration of acid. I believe the stuff in our pantry is usually 5% or less. To be considered an herbicidal vinegar, it has to be greater than that. I believe, I might get this wrong, but the herbicidal vinegar that we tried here at our Master Gardener garden was something along the lines of like 30 to 50% acid. Now, that is something that if you get 20 to 30, thank you, yes. So 20 to 30% acid, yeah, 50%, that'd be crazy. But 20% acid, that still hurts. You get that in your eye, you could cause permanent damage to your eye, burns your skin. A lot of our master gardeners said, well, let's use this vinegar as opposed to something like glyphosate, because glyphosate kills amphibians. I said, if this gets on a frog, it's going to kill the frog. It doesn't matter what it gets on. It's the toxicity, the acute toxicity, that immediate toxicity is much higher when we're talking about herbicidal vinegar. because it's such a potent acid. Um, but it is not systemic, so it only kills the tops of most of our plants, and that's the activity that it does. But this is something that has been used since we figured out what vinegar was, and we're putting it on our salads back in the ancient Greek days, which that's what I'm picturing in my head. They're making their Greek salads and their togas, and somebody accidentally pours it on a plant and the plant dies. Like, oh, but I'm sure it's probably even before then that they were using vinegar.
Yeah, I think it isn't, important to stress that this is herbicidal vinegar. There was a couple weeks ago, I was driving, remember where I was driving, but I just saw somebody walking out to their driveway with a gallon of white vinegar, just dumping it on plants. And I didn't have time to stop, but just kind of, like, well, good luck with that.
I just wondered how those conversations would go. You know, Hi, I'm a trained horticulturist. What you're doing is not a great idea.
I don't want to be that person, but
I don't either. Yeah, so I usually keep my mouth shut, even when maybe I should say something, but I don't. Yeah, that old-timey thing, something that's been used for a while. Vinegar.
all right. The next one we've got, and we've talked about this one in the past, so we probably don't need to beat a dead horse here, but pruning tars and paints. So I don't know how long this has been going on, at least probably early 1900s, if not longer than that, using some kind of tar, oil-based product, what have you, to paint the wounds on trees once they've been pruned. The idea is that's going to prevent any kind of pathogens or anything, insects from getting into there and damaging that newly pruned area, so the plant can seal off and heal itself. There's been countless studies done on this where that actually those paints, those tars, whatever you're using can actually inhibit that healing process. If you get any moisture trapped in there, any fungal spores or anything like that, now you've created a perfect environment because it's nice and moist. They're trapped in there with their food source, and you can get rot and stuff in there just as easily. So nowadays, and not one we would recommend. I think in the past it had been widely recommended, but not anymore. The one exception to that would be like oak trees. If you're pruning those during the growing season, when those beetles are potentially out, especially in the spring, seal that off so they're not moving the oak wilt and things like that into the trees. But that's the exception to the rule nowadays.
Yeah, that you gotta those tree wounds, we feel like when a human gets a wound, we gotta cover that puppy up. Tree wounds, they need oxygen to for those cells to seal that wound off. So yeah, only in that one instance, as Ken mentioned, when you're pruning that oak tree during the kind of beginning to middle part of the growing season. Well, Ken, this next one is one that I hear still a lot, and that is Epsom salts. Now, Epsom salts, they were discovered, I think, in like the Epsom Springs in England. That's where their name comes from, but they're really magnesium sulfide. Sulfide?
Eight,
Sulfate.
eight.
Sulfate. Sulfate, Ken. I wrote it down right here and I still messed it up. Magnesium sulfate. MgSO4, that's what it is. So the Epsom salts, that is something where most extension folks these days are saying, it's best to leave this as the foot soak, not necessarily for your plants, because really what that would provide would be magnesium. So if your soil test reveals that you are low in magnesium, well, then maybe you could use some Epsom salts to perk up that soil and to supply that nutrient that could be missing, but do a soil test to figure out if that's even the case.
Yeah, and you get sulfur too, but there's more efficient ways of getting sulfur to plants. And I'm not sure that's really one that we're too terribly deficient with
Yeah.
usually.
No, I've never really seen a soil test and seen it deficient in magnesium. I mean, it could be possible, but yeah, it not very common in Illinois at least. So yeah, it's another one of those, it probably was used a long time ago, and maybe it worked for somebody, and then it just sort of caught on from there. Though it really is not something that is need it. Save your money, save your time.
And was it um, magnesium deficiencies are a lot of times because of soil's too acidic. So
Yeah.
raising that pH, liming may rectify that situation too.
Yeah.
All right. Next one we've got is eggshells. I think eggshells is one of those that's been recommended for all kinds of things, increasing calcium. I've seen stuff on helping to keep slugs out if you grind it up, make it into little shards and makes it too prickly for them. And while, yes, there is a lot of calcium in eggshells, again, this is another one we've talked about multiple times.
Hmm.
That the calcium is tied up in those eggshells. It's not going to be released quickly. It's going to take some time for that to break down and be released into the soil. So maybe eventually your plants can take it up, or you got to grind it up into a fine powder. And even then, it's going to take some time to release that. So again, there's like Epsom salts. There's more efficient ways of getting calcium and stuff into your soil, into the plants that need it. And again, I think in a lot of cases, especially in gardens, there's probably not too many situations where we're getting calcium deficient in our soils in Illinois. It's probably pH issue, water issue in the case of blossom end rot. And, is calcium actually the cause of blossom end rot? There's debate to that as well. And then with the slugs, I don't know, they crawl over sand and stuff, and that doesn't bother them. I'm not sure eggshells would do a whole lot of good, but that slime trail, they can slime stuff up and crawl right over it. So again, there's other ways, making that habitat less hospitable to slugs, pulling away mulch, letting it dry out some. There's insecticides you can use as well. So again, other ways they're going to be more better at managing slugs than crumbling up eggshells and putting those on the ground.
Yeah. And I'd say very often you mentioned that calcium is usually plentiful in Illinois soils. In a lot of like cultivated situations, whether it's fruit and vegetable gardens, could be landscape beds, a lot of times we have an overabundance of calcium because calcium is a major component in lots of different fertilizers. Well, maybe not major, but it is a component in lots of different fertilizers. And so there's a lot of fertilizers out there. When you read those molecular formulas, very often you're going to find calcium in there. And especially when you're in like a controlled growing setting, like a greenhouse or a high tunnel, and you have just been injecting those fertilizers into that soil over and over again constantly for years, you wind up getting a immense buildup of calcium to the point where it becomes toxic to the plants. You have way too much calcium in your soil. And so yeah, soil tests most definitely. And if by chance you really are low on calcium, uh, though there is one trick you could try. This is so Ken and I were referencing a book by Jeff Gillman, Truth About Garden Remedies. And he talks about if you really, really are actually deficient in calcium, you could boil eggshells, like 11 to 12 eggshells. You could boil them and you could take about 2 cups of that water, and there is plant available calcium now in that water. And you could put them in there. Maybe it works for like container plants or something like that. So it is possible to extract that calcium out of eggshells, whether you boil them or you just use the natural time of soil to break it down. But that takes like a year or more. So yes, they can add calcium to the soil. You probably don't need it. And um, and so I've been going down so many rabbit holes recently, Ken. We talk about blossom end rot a lot, don't we? It's right now at
Yeah,
least.
every year.
Oh, I just read this great study about how it's a 2011 study, and this was all in a controlled setting, not in the ground, not in soil, but in containers in a greenhouse. But they took a calcium deficient potting mix, had tomatoes in one, and then tomatoes in another. With one as their control, they just watered with straight up water, and the other they watered, but then they also sprayed an ABA plant hormone, abscisic acid. ABA is helps in regulating water flow in plant vessels, and they found that their control had I'm going to get it wrong, but I'll put a link to this article down below. Like 40% of their tomatoes had about were showing blossom end rot. In their ABA treatment, no blossom end rot. So the plant hormone ABA helped in moving water throughout that plant tissue, and the plants didn't develop blossom end rot, even though there was a calcium deficient soil that it was growing in. It's fascinating stuff. So it's that water. We keep saying it's about water movement in the plants. Mulch your soil. Keep the soil evenly watered throughout the year. You'll reduce your chances of blossom end rot. Anyway, sorry, I got really carried away there.
That's all good. I'll have to read
Ken's
that
like,
study
calm
too.
down, calm down. It's just blossom end rot.
Science.
Science is so much fun. Well, I might go overboard with this one too, Ken. So this next one, this old-timey remedy, probably one of my favorite ones that we're talking about today.
I'll say this is the one that prompted the whole episode. So
Exactly. Yeah, I'm like, Ken, we got to figure out what people were doing way back when.
just needed an excuse to talk about this.
That's right. Yeah. So dynamite. Apparently that used to be a more of a popular thing way back when. And so I wanted to share, we have this article here. I've had this article pulled up for months here on my computer, just kind of waiting to use it. And this article comes from the 1920 edition of the Landscape Architecture magazine. So July 1920. So almost over 100 years ago this was published. So, and really what they are focused on with this article is using dynamite to transplant and then plant shrubs, trees, and in some cases, turf grass. And I'm guessing it's because it was the 1920s. Heavy equipment or just your run-of-the-mill garden tiller weren't all too common. So how are you going to bust up the soil and break that up without heavy equipment? Well, you just blow it up. And I think this is a pretty fascinating topic.
How much were they using?
All right.
Isn't like a stick.
So I'll just have to read this to you guys. So here's what they do. So they were going to transplant a hedge of shrubs. These shrubs were a height of 12 to 14 feet. They had a large spreading root system. And it was estimated it was going to cost about $200 because they were so large. So they decided instead of paying people to dig these up and all that physical labor, let's blast them out with dynamite. So the theory was it was going to shake all the soil off the roots, and you're going to get those plants out in better shape than if they were dug out by hand. So they bored down 1.5 inch diameter holes. They went down 18 inches deep, and they placed them around each plant at about 4 points. And they were about 1.5 feet away from the plant. That's not very far if you think about it. And they used 1/8 of a pound of dynamite per hole. They drilled the hole, and in that hole they tamped down 1/8 of a pound of dynamite. So I don't really know how that translates into that physical force, that explosive force, but 1/8. If you think about an entire stick of dynamite, it would be like 1/8 of that. Here's how it fared. So according to this article from Landscape Architecture magazine, in 1920, they said, this idea worked out better than had been hoped. The roots were not badly torn or broken. After the blast, the plants were easily dug out, and it cost an average of 30 cents to take up each shrub, as opposed to the $200 for each one. Not for each one, for them total.
So I'll say I did a currency conversion. So $200 in 1920 was well over $3,100 in today's money.
Oh my gosh, that's more than cutting a tree down today.
It said 20 cents per tree now.
30 cents to take up each shrub.
So 30 cents in 1920 money to 2024 is $4.71 according to this calculator.
So yeah, let's compare $4 versus 3,000. That's a lot of money saved.
Good return on investment there.
Mhm. So it continues. They now have all these shrubs blown up out of the ground. They have to replant them. Well, they thought they were going to have to dig this big wide trench. It was going to cost a lot of labor. So to avoid all that labor, they had some extra dynamite lying around, and they just blew holes in the ground, and they then just easily dug out that loose soil. For that one, they used 1/6 of a pound of dynamite to plant each shrub, and it would cost about 10 cents a plant. So we're probably talking what, $1 a plant there, almost $1.50 a plant. So the total cost, including labor, taking them up and replanting, was approximately 55 cents a plant, or $110 for the entire job.
So $110 is a little over $1,700 in today's money.
Okay. That's so you're saving about half, you're saving like half your costs there. And they said not a plant was injured by the blasting. So therefore they all survived in their transplanting. I mean, just imagine if you could go to your local garden center and there were just like sticks of dynamite on the wall. And yeah, that would be you would need a special license to garden, I think.
It'd definitely be more eventful and exciting
Mhm.
for sure.
But there's more, Ken. There's more to this dynamite story. So this next section of the article talks about rejuvenating trees and lawn using dynamite. And so the idea here is that they were going to use dynamite to break up hard soil. So in a circle around this tree, they bore holes about 4 feet deep, and in each hole they put down 1/4 pound of dynamite. So we're talking about a little bit more here than what we use with the shrubs. Um, the owner, so they describe how the owner here was afraid that the blasting would damage the lawn, but after the shots, the only effect apparent was the formation of little mounds of earth 2 to 3 inches high at the top of the boring holes. 3 months after the blasting, an improvement began to be noted in these are willow trees. The leaves, which had been very yellow, changed to a bright and healthy green. The pines, which the previous year had been grown only 4 inches, by the end of the first month, they had grown over 12 inches now after they had been blasted. And the lawn had previously been all right, so long as frequent rains would occur, but it could not withstand any dryness. It would quickly decline, and it would get all these cracks and stuff, what a typical lawn gets. They showed that the lawn was treated then by putting down holes. They were 12 feet apart, 3 feet deep, each one loaded with 1/4 pound of charge of dynamite, tamped that in, blew up their lawn. And it was noted during the first rain that fell, the ground absorbed the rain much better than previously. And later in the year, when it dried out, no cracks or fissures formed, and the lawn grass did not become yellow and brown as it had done before. So the lawn even looked better. So and as they're talking about this as if they are improving the compaction of the soil, which I think is definitely a possibility. But what else is in dynamite that might help plants? Do you know, Ken?
Some nitrogen in there.
Yeah, baby, there's some nitrogen in that dynamite. Before World War II, we had we made all these explosives, and then now after World War II, we didn't know what to do with all these explosive, and they said, "Hey, let's start throwing them on the ground because apparently there's nitrogen in there, which our plants need." And so as and it's not, I don't think it's specifically stated in this article about the nitrogen component, but you can go and review other articles, modern and historic, about the release of nitrogen during these early times when people were using dynamite to revive plants. So it would release nitrogen into the soil in addition to maybe, easing compaction. And so imagine all that energy, all that nitrogen pow in your ground, and the plants get a big old boost of that. So there's two and maybe a few other things happening here with dynamite. So and kind of the last section here is how they use it to revive an old hedge. And in the suburbs of Philadelphia, hemlock spruce hedge, 18-foot high, 300-foot long, had been neglected, and they thought they could spade up the ground, but as in their words, it would merely loosen up 1 foot of earth and cause the essence of the fertilizer to be used up in the foot of this ground. Which I love how they wrote back then, far better than we write or speak today. And it was finally decided to place 1/2 stick. So now we're up to a half a stick of dynamite every 10 foot along this hedge. The shots were placed 4 foot from the main stem of the plant, one on each side. So you have, 4 foot away from each side of the plant, you got a half a thing of dynamite in the ground. Tight tamping was used to keep the effect down in the ground. And then they top dressed with manure to a depth of 6 inches. At the end of the second year, it's almost impossible to see, though, what was once a straggly hedge. If dynamite had not been used, it would probably have taken 3 times as long to get the fertilizer down to the roots. And so it sounds like the hedge looked much better the next year, if I'm translating their 1920s English, which is the same English I use. So.
Kind of want to get some dynamite now.
I know, don't you? It's like, I wonder what I could do with some dynamite, other than get the cops called on
So I
me.
end up on some watch lists.
Probably, yeah. It's like, I swear, I'm just gardening. It's all I'm using it for. Oh, but that's a fun one. It's a fun article to read. Yeah, we'll leave a link to that one below in the show description.
Maybe we need to get a grant so we can look at exploding stuff with and without nitrogen. I don't know if there's
There
any
you go.
explosives that don't have nitrogen in them, but
I'm willing to find out and see what happens.
I don't know if I want to start searching for that.
No. Go to a public computer somewhere where there's no cameras. So.
All right. And I think the last ones we have, we can kind of lump all these together. We've got old-timey ways of killing stuff. So I think in our case, what we're looking at insects, I think one of these is for, they're using it for powdery mildew, I think. So yeah, so like we mentioned earlier, a lot of times we talk about pest control back in the day, and it's like, oh, that's all idyllic, and they didn't do anything, but there's some gnarly stuff. So one, which I don't know if you can still get nicotine sulfate. I don't know if that's still
I think it's
available
illegal now.
But
I don't think you can buy that.
But until, I don't know, relatively recently, we'll say you could get it. So for some of this stuff, some kind of you should not be doing this, but one recommendation was from a book from 1915, steep 5 pounds of tobacco stems in 3 gallons of water for 3 hours, strain the tobacco stems off, dilute the mixture with enough water to make 7 gallons of spray, and then you'd apply that to your plants. So the active ingredient nicotine in there is a stimulant. So basically that it overstimulates nerves, and the insects and stuff would go into convulsions and die because of this. So that was applied to plants. It's also very toxic to humans as well, which is why you can no longer find it, at least in the United States.
Yeah, it stimulates insects, and it also stimulates humans, so it works on us too. So be careful with that stuff.
That's why you get addicted to it. But this is much higher concentrations than what you'd be smoking or chewing. And another thing with this, I came across in some places that tobacco mosaic virus can survive in this. So if you're steeping this, and I had a professor in grad school who would talk about, they would get cigarettes from Russia or the Soviet Union, and they would always be full of tobacco mosaic virus, because even after the curing and stuff, the virus was still in that tobacco. So if you're making this, that virus can then get into that spray. And if you're applying this to tomatoes, the peppers, other solanaceous crops that this virus can infect, you've now sprayed this virus all over it, and those plants can then be infected. So that's another risk of applying at least these homemade concoctions using tobaccos, that you could potentially spread this virus as well if you're using um, tobacco that's been infected with tobacco mosaic virus.
I think we need to get a historic plant pathologist on the show to talk about tobacco mosaic virus. It's a fascinating virus, an ancient virus.
So another one came across is called Forsyth's composition. This is from William Forsyth, who was a gardener back in the 1700s. He was King George III's gardener as well, and renowned as one of the greatest plantsmen of his time. And as an aside, Forsythia, the genus Forsythia, is named after him. So still talk about him today indirectly. So his concoction that he was making as a pesticide consisted of 1 bushel of cow dung, 1 bushel of lime rubbish from old buildings, half a bushel of wood ash, 1/16 bushel of river sand. This mixture was finally sifted and mixed with urine or soapy water until it was the consistency of paint. At this point, it would be applied to the plant that is trying to be protected. Then after application, a recommendation that a dry powder containing wood ash and bone ash at a ratio of 6:1 should be dusted over it. And this was supposed to correct problems with insect infestations, as well as considered especially good for covering tree wounds. So there's another tree wound possibility for you here. So yeah, I'd imagine
I'd stay away from, if I was a bug, I'd stay away from that plant. Yeah, if they were spraying that on there.
So
A bushel of cow dung.
Yes, I think this was from 1791. This came from. So back, let's say back then, 1700s and 1800s, and probably earlier too. Kind of one of the prevailing thoughts was that the stronger the odor something had, the better it would be at repelling pests. I don't know. Pests don't necessarily smell. They smell, but the smells that we find offensive, they may not necessarily find offensive. So I'm not sure. Probably not doing a whole lot for you. It's going to smell really bad. Yeah, just don't do it. Probably not a good idea.
No.
Let's see. Here's another one. This was from 1849, from a book titled "The Spraying of Plants," which was written in 1906. They talk about this particular concoction, which is even worse than the first one. So 1 hectoliter, which is 26.4 gallons of urine, added to 25 liters or 6.6 gallons of pigeon dung. And this is then fermented for 48 hours, at which point 1 kilogram or 2.2 pounds of aconite branches, also known as monk's hood, was added, along with 4 liters or 3.8 gallons of water. And this was applied to leaves to prevent mildew. So this was recommended in 1849, was intended to provide a cure for mildew on peaches with a simple single application made in April. So
the pigeon poop. Do you know how dirty bird poop is? Well, we do today, but I guess they didn't know that back then. My gosh.
And urine, and let it ferment for 48 hours. So you can just imagine what that would smell like.
Spray it on your peaches. Ooh, baby, that would be. Would you like some peach cobbler? No, thank you.
So I guess, so with powdery mildew, that's one of the, well, I won't say the only disease, but there's maybe others out there, but that's a disease where it doesn't actually like moisture on leaves of plants. So this does well in really humid conditions, but if you have free water or water sitting on the leaves, powdery mildew doesn't really do all that well. It doesn't really infect plants. It gets washed off and stuff. So it could potentially protect it from that because you're just washing it off and making those leaves wet. But let's say the potential human pathogens you're introducing far outweigh any benefit. Now, if you're doing this in April, I would think maybe it's out of there, but still Don't do it. It's
Just
gross.
spraying it on you're probably getting it on yourself. I imagine their spray equipment back in the 1800s was not a not as sophisticated as today. And today I still, if I'm spraying something, I still get stuff that falls back on you. So
Mhm. Yes. So don't do that one. Um, and then our last one, and these are a little more, again, old timey, but even into the 1900s, people were using these. So a lot of insecticides contained arsenic, lead arsenate was an ingredient in a lot of things. Mercury in the form of red oxide of mercury or mercury 2 oxide, all of which these are incredibly toxic and not safe. So when we talk about modern day insecticides being much less toxic, quote unquote, safer than the older ones, because a lot of these had these heavy metals in there that are very toxic. Um, and applying those, constantly applying those are then in the soil and they don't go away and all that. So not only that toxicity, acute chronic toxicity, but the potential of that to build up in soils um, as well. So back in the day, um, controlling pests wasn't as probably as idyllic and rainbows and butterflies as we like to think a lot of times.
Ken and we were just describing like, a lot of people had to grow food to live not terribly long ago, over 100 years ago, probably. And you were desperate to get food. So you had to spray stuff. You had to control pests so that you yourself wouldn't starve and maybe the immediate risk of starving outweighed the let's just throw whatever we can at this. I don't know what it does, but we'll see what happens. We have to eat. So spray cow dung and pigeon poop and all this stuff on our plants and yeah, see what works.
Yeah, I'm looking at some of these older ones too. There's a lot of copper, which is still used today as a
Mhm.
fungicide. So some of these we're still probably not the exact same formulations, but some of these chemicals or compounds we're still using to some extent. Soaps and oils. And that's probably another one we could talk about, like dish soap. That's probably a
Mhm.
little more of a modern one, but yeah, that's effective on. It can be effective in controlling pests, but it also can be very effective at. So the soap is removing that kind of that waxy cuticle on insects, which causes them to dry out. Well, plants also have that waxy cuticle, and that can also be removed from the plants when you're using stuff like dish soap because it's a lot of times, it's a lot stronger than the insecticidal stuff. So when you're using dish soap on plants, a lot of times you're getting a lot of plant damage as well because those soaps are removing that wax, not only from the insects but from the plants you're trying to protect too.
Mhm.
So while dish soap is cheaper than the insecticidal soaps, spend the extra couple dollars and get the stuff that's actually intended to be used on plants. And like I say, you're not going to have any plant damage, but you're a lot less likely to have plant damage, especially if you read and follow the label directions.
That's the key. Yeah. I uh, had a person, they sprayed that. It was an oil in this case, and they had aphids and they sprayed that oil and they thought it was a horticultural oil labeled, you know, it was intended to be sprayed on plants. They said, well, I sprayed the amount, but I just dumped the whole thing on there because I just figured, more is better. And they killed their plants. So, um, yeah, I think in oil, is it the opposite of soap where it actually covers and coats the insect? And in this case, also the leaves and the stomata, the air exchange opening of the leaves, and it just kind of smothers them. Is it kind of that flip side of that?
Yeah, it basically clogs up the spiracles, how they breathe. And there's different types of oils too. So there's dormant oils, which are a little, I guess you could say, a little thicker. And there's summer oils, which are more refined. Because some of those oils, if you get them in real hot temperature, warmer hot temperatures, or a lot of sun, that can cause plant
Mhm.
damage. Even though they're labeled for
Burn
use on
them.
plants, those dormant oils need to be used a lot of times before plants start leafing out because they can damage green tissues.
Yeah. Well, fascinating. And, as you're saying that, Ken, here's just a random good growing tip of the day. You cannot burn plants with water. Just saying, can't do that. It's not possible.
What if it's boiling water?
Well, don't put boiling water on there, but I hear a lot of folks say, "Well, I can't water my plant in the middle of the day when it's sunshine and it's going to burn it." Like, no, you can't burn it with water. Um, you it will evaporate before it ever gets that hot. So don't you worry.
Doesn't concentrate the sun rays that much.
Exactly. Yes. Now, boiling water is another old. Well, is it an old-timey trick? Because yeah, it might have been, but a lot of people use it today, and then they burn their feet or their hands as they're trying to carry that water out to the patio and kill some weeds in the cracks.
Say, and that'd be similar to vinegar. That's going to kill your top growth, but not necessarily kill the roots.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe for seedlings, but established plants, they'll probably laugh at you and send out some new growth.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Well, that was a lot of great information about some of those old tricks, if we could even call them tricks. I feel like it's almost a trick on the gardener in this case of spraying cow poop on your peaches to cure disease and stuff. But yeah, a lot of great information about old-timey garden things that it was a good idea that they stayed back there in history. There's probably a reason why we don't bleed people when they have a head cold anymore. It's because we figured out that doesn't really help them. So yeah, thank goodness for science. Yeah, I'm so excited for it. But I do kind of wish maybe we had a little bit more dynamite in the garden centers. I'll have to wait sometime. Well, the Good Growing Podcast is a production of University of Illinois Extension, edited this week by Ken Johnson. Thank you, Ken, for both editing and being with me here today to chat about these old-timey garden hack tricks, things, etc. that we should not necessarily be doing. So thanks, Ken.
Yes, thank you. And let's try not to end up on any watch lists for our dynamite explosive searches.
Exactly.
Use in the garden. And let's do this again next week.
Oh, we shall do this again next week. Oh my goodness, gardening season. Here it comes. I feel like the door's closing on me. The window's about shut. We still have time though, folks. We still got time. Got more episodes coming at you. So listeners, thank you for doing what you do best, and that is listening. Or if you're watching us on YouTube, watching. And as always, keep on growing. Keep the lid on that one then, Ken. Don't tell anybody. You two listeners, don't tell anyone.
It's a secret.
Secrets.
Yeah. Candle. Is it secret? Is it safe?
Samwise Gamgee, have you been eavesdropping? This devolved into a Lord of the Rings fan cast. We forgot salt. Salt's the big one. Sorry, everyone. We forgot salt. Next time, salt.